Honkai Star Rail has been around for over a year and it's come a long way. The meta has changed a few times as newer characters get introduced, and so far it's somehow felt pretty fresh, at least to me. We've had hypercarry comps, follow-up attack teams, dots, and even break-oriented metas, all of which feel largely different and fun to play. Each time the meta shifts, everything literally changes. So for today, we're going to take a break from lore and discuss the different metas or team comps that now exist in the game, as well as some of my more favorite ones. Before we talk about that in more detail though, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. First and foremost, this isn't a list. Well, it kinda is, but the placement of each meta or playstyle doesn't mean anything here. I'm not rating any of these playstyles in any meaningful way, just sharing some thoughts on what I think about them and where they might go in the future. So don't take this as a deep dive or meta-analysis video, I'm really just sharing my opinions. I'm a lore content creator, and while I do theory craft, it's not the meta theory crafting you might be thinking of. More nonsense story theories. Also, I'll use the term meta, playstyle, and team comp rather interchangeably throughout this video, but they basically mean the same thing here. With disclaimers out of the way, let's start this discussion. The game has been around for more than a year, and in that time, the roster of playable characters has grown from 23 to a respectable 59. We've been to several planets and have met a plethora of different factions. Each path and faction seem to have their own general playstyle, with Nihility characters focusing more on debuffs and dots, while Erudition are the de facto AoE characters. To be honest with you, when this game first came out, I was kind of skeptical whether Hoyoverse could keep a turn-based game interesting, at least in terms of its gameplay. I've played quite a few of them, and the meta tends to just focus on who can dish out the most damage. While that's mostly been true here as well, I have thoroughly enjoyed how they have approached doing it. There's a variety of different team setups to choose from, and they each handle as well as require different things. Let's start off with the very first comp everyone used, the literal granddaddy of the metas, the hypercarry comp. The first ever summonable character we got was Zilla, and with her came the hypercarry setup. This type of team comp basically comprises of one main damage dealer, and every other character slot is filled with supportive characters that can boost the DPS to ridiculous heights. Whether you have supports to increase their damage or give them more turns, the more you dumped everything into the main DPS, the better the results would be. If you don't really know how to build teams, hypercarry is probably the easiest to understand. As long as you grasp how and what benefits your hypercarry the most, it's easy to figure out what characters can or should fill the other slots. Take Imbibitor Lune for example, who can do a buttload of damage but needs a lot of skill points. Once you understand that, characters that can give skill points, energy, or is overall SP positive like Sparkle, Luocha, and Ting Yun are all suitable teammates for Daniel. In terms of fun, I personally have been using hypercarry less and less, not because they are ineffective, but more because there are so many other comps to choose from, and having used hypercarries for a long time, they started to feel a little stale. The only one I'm currently using right now is Acheron, whose damage is so disgusting that in itself becomes fun. This comp isn't without its problems, however. One negative is that everything hinges on a single character. If your carry gets stunned, killed, or has no SP, then your damage potential kinda drops a lot. Of course, there are ways of ensuring your main DPS doesn't die, but every so often you might get unlucky, and when they do get knocked out, that's the end of your run. Nevertheless, hypercarry comps are tried and true and has been around since the beginning of the game, so I don't see them going away anytime soon. They will likely see variations in the future in terms of what activates their kits, like Daniel needing some skill points or Acheron needing debuffs, but the core mechanic will likely still remain the same. Let's move on to the next type of team comp. Now, usually, it's a better idea to talk about my favorite comp all the way at the end so that people stick around longer. But I'm having so much fun with this particular comp that I'm just gonna talk about it now. Follow-up attack comps is probably the meta or team comp that is seeing the most love right now. In its early days, you had really only a handful of characters who could do follow-up attacks, and when Topaz came out, it elevated this comp briefly. But recently, we've been getting a lot of really good characters. Robin came in as a supporter, Aventurine is a godly preservation character, and we even got a free March in 2.4 that works really well with follow-up characters. Throw in the follow-up attack version of Acheron, Fei Shao, and you start to see the comp come together. What makes follow-up so satisfying is the fact that you can continuously chain attacks back to back under the right circumstances. When your whole team can attack when it's not even their turn, you get closer to those single turn clears you hear the big boys talk about so often. My current favorite comp is Fei Xiao, March, Robin and Aventurine, as the team feels so incredibly strong that it feels like I'm cheating. Even characters like Clara or Dr. Ratio is fun to use. Each time Ratio throws his nuclear-empowered chalk at an enemy and destroys them, it's always fun to watch. If you jump into the simulated universe and get the right blessings, this team comp goes beyond insane. It feels like you're on auto, but not really, destroying bosses and enemies almost immediately. Without a doubt, we are currently in the follow-up attack renaissance or golden age, and this is currently the most fun I've personally had with any team comp. If I had to come up with some negative for follow-up attacks, it would be that most characters have specific triggers that can sometimes be out of your control to activate. Take Clara or Yunli for example, who need to be hit to trigger their follow-up attack. Sometimes these triggers just don't happen, and when they don't, then follow-up attack feels kinda meh. Clara needs to be hit, and when the enemies gang up on this little shoeless child, Svarog goes absolutely ham. But if for some reason the enemies don't feel like hitting a child, then Clara doesn't shine as well. That said, Fei Xiao's trigger is as simple as a normal attack, so maybe in the future we'd get less restrictive triggers, but I imagine Hoyoverse won't go too crazy with this, as I can see it get out of hand pretty fast. The possibilities are functionally endless, and we're now even seeing follow-up healers like with Ling Sha, so maybe in the future we will get follow-up buffers or breakers, who knows. Speaking of breakers, let's move on to the next meta comp we currently have, the break focused or super break. Now this particular comp or meta is pretty interesting. It sort of came and went almost immediately. Before Penacony, break focused teams were not as common. Break was an important mechanic, sure, as it applied debuffs and essentially stunned the enemy, but there wasn't any specific character that benefited from focusing solely on break. We did start to get buffers like Ruanmei who scaled off of break and DOT characters, but nothing that seemed specifically designed for it. That is until the main character learned some new dance moves. Around the time we got the Harmony Trailblazer, their girlfriend/stalker Firefly and somewhat cursing buddy Boothill also dropped. When these characters were paired together, the damage numbers were insane. Break was also a pretty safe comp to play because, as I mentioned, it essentially stunned enemies, preventing them from taking action. So if you kept stunning or breaking the enemy, you don't really get attacked. What makes Super Break comps good is also its main problem though. There is a lack of characters and support around this particular team setup. If you were putting together a team, you really want to have Trailblazer and Ruanmei. One of those characters is given away for free, but the other one is a limited character that is pretty much needed on a lot of other teams. The conditions that are required to meet the maximum damage potential of Super Break characters are also pretty constraining. Take Firefly for example. If you can break the enemy, have Trailblazer's ult up, and can skill with her, she does absolutely nasty fire damage. But if even one of those conditions aren't met, she does relatively lower damage. So Super Break is good, but feels a bit restrictive. I think once more characters are released, we might see this comp rise to the levels it's meant to, but until then, it feels like the early days of follow-up attack comps. Strong, but only under specific conditions. The fourth team setup that I want to discuss is one that has recently been on the back seat. You could even argue that it never really reached a level of prominence like the others, but has always kinda been there. While it has some of the most unique and memorable characters lore-wise, damage over time comps are kind of in a weird place. On one hand, the comp is very reliable, but on the other hand, the damage and multipliers we currently see aren't at the same level as the last three comps we've talked about so far. That doesn't mean it's bad, just that the others are comparatively better. The good thing about damage over time is that once you've stacked enough dot status on the enemy, the damage will continue to ramp up. Each time the enemy takes a turn, they will take on all this damage first. There's a level of satisfaction that you get from seeing an enemy inflicted with so many status effects that even Papa Nurgle would be proud. The damage also scales purely on attack, so building dot characters is pretty easy. But what makes damage over time comps satisfying is also kind of its problem. While the other comps front load a lot of their damage, as in when you trigger your skill you do the damage over time comps need a lot of setup. You need to first apply the DOT either through skills or breaking the enemy, and then you need to wait for the enemy to take their turn for the damage to trigger. Now, there's a way around that second problem, but is in itself a problem. To fix it, you need a specific dot trigger character like Kafka. Kafka's skill and ult allows her to forcibly trigger dots applied to the enemy, so you don't have to wait. The problem is that, well, you need Kafka. There are other characters that can trigger specific dots like Gunaifen, but it only works for a specific element dot, in her case fire or burn. There's also a big difference between the 4-star dot characters and the 5-star characters. I mean, Sampo is great and all, but Black Swan has so much utility and damage to her kit, it's hard to compare them. Much like Superbreak, damage over time suffers from a lack of characters, with Nihility right now sort of split between the OT characters and the buffers, so they don't have a big roster. Personally, damage over time to me is pretty fun, and I've cleared some of the higher MOC levels with DOT characters, but I'm running the most optimum team of Kafka, Black Swan, Ranmei, and Huo Huo. So I wouldn't say DOT is bad at all, but probably needs a bit more attention to really shine. Damage over time really needs to see more characters in its roster, as well as perhaps some tweaking of its numbers and multipliers. That said, if you've ever played DOT teams in the simulated universe, it's almost as satisfying as follow-up attack teams. The damage that flows out from wind shears, burns, and shocks is so beautiful to see, it's almost like a firework of pain exploding from every orifice the enemy has. Right now, it feels a bit sidelined, but still okay in general. I'd say it's more middle-high table at the moment rather than completely unusable. And that's really how most of these comps feel anyway. They're good, just not top table, and that's fine. Finally, we reach the 5th and final team setup, an AoE or erudition focused comp. Now, if I had to pick a comp that was my least played, erudition focused comps would be my answer. I'm not saying it's bad or anything, just that in comparison to the other ones, I've never felt like erudition is at the same power levels. This could entirely be due to my own incompetence, but among all the ones listed here, erudition feels the least powerful, at least to me. That said, even if AoE damage feels generally weaker in comparison, erudition in the current meta does have a place to call home, namely Pure Fiction. Pure Fiction is where erudition becomes extremely valuable, but for every other content, there are many other better choices. Erudition is also relatively easy to set up and works right out of the box. Some characters like Himeko or Herta have specific triggers, but not something you can't control. I've long felt that erudition or AoE type teams lack something that can push them over the top. A light cone, a support, a DPS, something that can boost them higher, but there really isn't anything like that right now. I suspect that this has mostly to do with balancing, as if you make an AoE character hit too hard, there's really no reason to play most of the other characters or comps. For now, AoE characters are the ones I summon the least of, and to be honest, even the current roster, you don't really need to summon for the 5-star exclusives. Himeko and Herta are more than sufficient to run in your Pure Fiction teams, so there isn't any incentive to go for Jade, Jingyuan, or Argenti unless you like them for other reasons or for purely elemental reasons. Now, as we near the end of this video, let me reiterate my reminders. This isn't a tier list. The order here bears no actual significance and everything is my subjective feeling. Honestly, when I said that the game is well balanced, I mean that each of those comps are entirely viable for all game modes. Sure, some are better than others, but it doesn't mean that the characters you have are all bad just because they're not in the current meta. At the end of the day, play whatever feels the most fun to you. Don't feel obligated to play only hypercarry or follow-up attack because they are the strongest right now. The meta of focus is always changing, and those dot characters you are building today may become an absolute menace in the future when the right characters or light cones drop. So play what's fun for you. I know that this has been a long video, but I thought to share these opinions with all of you. What is your favorite comp as of the current patch, and where do you think these metas will go in the future? Also, if I missed out a comp, feel free to share it in the comments. If you've watched all the way to the end and found this discussion mildly fascinating, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.